Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the National Press Club. My name is John Hughes. I'm the president of the National Press Club. I'm also an editor for Bloomberg's First Word. That's Bloomberg News' breaking news desk here in Washington. We are here for a special event. For the first time in 53 years, we will hear Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King, in his own voice, addressing the National Press Club. We will hear his voice here in the very room where he spoke. Dr. King stood approximately right in the middle of that area over there. We will have experts commenting on the significance of his words at the National Press Club that day. First, I want to introduce some people without whom this event would not be possible. Gil Klein was the organizer. Gil is a former National Press Club president. He's chairman of the club's History and Heritage Committee, and he's the journalism director of American University's Washington Semester Program. And we thank him for all the work he put into organizing this program. Joe Madison is our moderator. Joe. Joe is known as the Black Eagle. He is heard coast to coast each weekday morning on Sirius XM's Urban View channel. Talker magazine has named him one of the 10 most important radio talk show hosts on 9 different occasions. And we so appreciate his work on this program and that he's willing to be our moderator. Joe will be introducing our distinguished guests on the panel to my left. However, I want to say a few words about one of them. Mr. Simeon Booker is one of, yes, Mr. Simeon Booker, sitting to the second of my left, is one of the all-time greats of American journalism. In 1982, he won the National Press Club's highest honor, the Fourth Estate Award, given for career achievement. He was the first African American to win the award. He was the 10th person to ever win it. And Mr. Booker, it is an extreme privilege to have you here in the club. You are our hero. This club is your house. Welcome home. I also want to welcome our C-SPAN and Sirius XM audiences, and you can follow the action on Twitter this evening. Use the hashtag NPCLive. That's NPCLive for everyone on Twitter. Now, here's a little background on the speech. Dr. King was the first African American to ever speak at a National Press Club luncheon. He did this on July 19th, 1962. The speech came 1 week after his second arrest in Albany, Georgia. And he would be arrested a third time in Albany at a prayer vigil exactly 8 days after he gave this speech. His press club talk came more than a year before Dr. King's most famous I Have a Dream speech on the National Mall. Now, here is how the evening will work. First, Joe Madison will interview Mr. Booker, who was a club member who not only attended the speech in 1962, but he helped organize it as a member of the club's speakers committee. Second, Joe will interview by telephone Dr. C.B. Jones. Dr. Jones helped write the speech. Then we will hear 4 speech excerpts in the order that Dr. King said them. We will hear his opening, and we will hear his closing. And we have 2 excerpts in the middle of the speech. There will be a panel discussion of these first, middle, and ending sections after each section. One of these middle excerpts is a video clip. Everything else is audio, but there is one video clip. This video clip is the only known video clip of this speech to exist. There is no video or film of this event beginning to end that we know of, and we've searched far and wide. At the time we were doing these National Press Club lunches in the 60s, we only recorded them. We did not film them all as we do today. So while there is no video of the entirety of the speech, and we are not able to play for you the entirety of the speech in the Q&A because that would take too long, I want you to know that this video clip, the audio, and the entire speech is on our website at press.org/MLK. That's press.org/MLK. You will also see there a printed transcript of this entire event, beginning to end, including all the questions he was asked that day. That's available on the website, free. Feel free to access that and learn a lot more about this speech after tonight. After we hear the clips and discuss them, Joe will interview journalist Bruce Johnson, and then Joe will close the program promptly at 9 p.m. Now, Dr. King's appearance here was one of the most significant things to ever happen at the National Press Club. And to mark the significance of this event, and let me tell you, it's long past due, we've made a plaque that we're bringing out for the first time here today. And I said at the beginning of my presidency we were going to do this. We're going to put this plaque right outside these doors of the ballroom, just to the left. There's a photo of LBJ and Nixon there right now. LBJ and Nixon are just going to get moved. They're not going to go away, but they are going to get moved because that is a highly prominent spot to have observed that this highly significant event happened, and that plaque will be at the National Press Club, which really is a living museum. If you walk around and look at the walls, that plaque will be there as long as the Press Club stands. And while I am only president for another week, believe me, if I ever come back and do not see that plaque hanging there, there will be nonviolent direct action to make sure that that plaque is returned. And I don't think anybody's ever going to move it, frankly, because we're all in awe of what we're all going to hear tonight. And I heard some of the excerpts earlier this afternoon, and it sent chills down my spine. With no further ado, I want to introduce Mr. Joe Madison.
Thank you. For more than half a century, Simeon Booker devoted his career in journalism to race relations, black politics, and watched the civil rights movement evolve from its very beginning. And the stories that he and his fellow black journalists told and the things they encountered are chronicled in a book that he has written, a biography. In putting this panel together, the first thing we had to do was make sure that all the participants were alive and here with us. And when you consider it's been 50 plus years, we wanted to dig deep and far and get people who understood exactly what went on. You know, it's interesting, the National Press Club, the very first speaker, as you heard, was African-American speaker, was Martin Luther King Jr. And you begin to wonder, why did it take so long to have the first speaker in 1962? You could have had Jackie Robinson, Thurgood Marshall, Marian Anderson, the list goes on and on and on, Booker T. Washington. Then you realize that they didn't admit their first woman to the press club until 1971. And Nikita Khrushchev made that happen. So we've come a long way. And the person who has watched that journey is Simeon Booker. Simeon Booker, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't know, Jet Magazine would not be Jet Magazine without that Simeon Booker piece. And so, and his wife, Carol, is right beside him, and let's give her a round of applause for the work that she has done. Now, Simeon, first of all, thanks for being here. And let's get to this. You were on the committee that actually decided to invite Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to be the speaker. To the best of your recollection, what went on in that meeting? What was it like? And Carol, if you can fill in, because I know there's an extensive paragraph in his autobiography about that meeting. But what do you remember, Simeon?
Two hearing aids make this a challenge. What do you remember about the decision to invite Dr. King? Do you remember some tension on the Speakers Committee?
Oh, no.
Doesn't remember. But he did remember when he wrote this book. So he's asked me to tell you.
Read that, and then maybe it might jar his memory there.
At 97, memory fades with every day.
But this chapter in that book, yes.
It is. This is from Shocking the Conscience,
right.
A reporter's account of the Civil Rights Movement, which Simeon wrote in 2013. It was published by University Press of Mississippi, ironically. But he writes that he remembered the first time that Dr. King spoke at the club in 1962. Simeon was only the second member of the club. The
second African-American member.
Second African-American. The first being Louis Lortier. But Louis didn't participate. And when Simeon was sponsored for membership, he was urged to be an active member. And he was. He joined the Speakers Committee, which was one of the most important committees because it was the committee that chose the speakers for these wonderful newsmaker luncheons here at the club. So he proposed that Dr. King speak. Now, Dr. King had gotten some notoriety, a lot of press, because of the Montgomery bus boycott, but he had never been interviewed by the national press. And Simeon thought the time had come. It was a year before the March on Washington and the I Have a Dream speech. And it was 2 years before Dr. King became the youngest recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. So, and he still had not been named Time Magazine's Man of the Year either. So Jet Magazine had had Dr. King on its cover at least twice. And if you know the history of Jet Magazine, the cover was usually a young starlet, a pretty young woman. Here was a newsmaker taking the cover, and that was rather unusual for Johnson Publishing. And King had never addressed a large audience of the national press. Also at the same time in 1962, maybe even earlier, but in 62 at least, the FBI itself will admit that J. Edgar Hoover had targeted Dr. King as a possible pawn of the communist movement in America, as anybody who participated in civil rights at that time was suspect by the FBI as being not only a troublemaker, but possibly a pawn of the communist movement. So J. Edgar Hoover used the press, people that he knew, to send out rumors. And I think it might have been that, more than any racial issue, that caused dissension on
the committee to invite him to speak.
Yes, because the chairman of the committee resigned in protest when the committee accepted Simeon's recommendation that Dr. King speak.
The chairman of the
Speakers
Committee.
Yeah, yeah. So he was the only one, but the speech itself, as we'll get to later on, is a magnificent speech. And you can tell from the questions that followed it that the seed had been planted, because there is one question about whether it had been written by Stanley Levinson, a New York lawyer who was considered by the FBI to be communist tainted.
Is there, now I know that, and maybe I can get closer with this microphone, so if you would translate, is there anything, Simeon, that you've heard that you want to add, or did Carol pretty much get your thoughts there that you put down in the book? If you can.
Can you hear Joe? Can you hear him?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything you would add to my brilliant summary? What? Remember, we're going home together tonight.
Well, keep talking.
You know, Joe, sometimes...
No, look, I got that treatment when I first walked into his office many years ago. Keep talking, just keep talking, right.
Sometimes it's better if I'm not in the room, because then he'll talk. But if I'm here, he'll say, oh, you do it. Now, come on, Simeon, talk a bit.
Do what?
Talk a bit.
About what?
Dr. King.
Almost forgotten him.
It's tough after all these years. You don't realize, people will ask Simeon when he was on the Freedom Rides, how did he feel in the back of that bus when people were being beaten up? And he'll say, you know, I don't remember. And 50 years later, even the most vivid events kind of pall, especially when there's one event after another.
If you don't mind, I tell you what I want to do, and that is to go to another individual who is out in San Francisco at Stanford University. I've had the pleasure of interviewing him on several occasions. He was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s advisor, his lawyer, and by the way, his speechwriter. And it was by chance that we were discussing this program, and that I mentioned we would be doing this, Carol and Simeon, and he said, Joe, I helped write that speech. And that is Dr. Clarence Jones, who is scholar in residence at Stanford University at the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute. And Dr. Jones, I know you're a long way away, but can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, good. Glad that you're with us. And if we can give Dr. Jones a round of applause, I would really... We've given somewhat of the background of how this came about. So let me ask you, just how important was this speech to Dr. King at the time?
Well, we thought it was an important speech. First of all, let me just state for the record is that the speech was fundamentally his speech, but it was we had a lot of discussion about it, provided some draft material he should consider was jointly done with Stanley Levinson. So the FBI was right. Stanley Levinson and I played a great role in preparing the text of the speech. I had a rather cynical attitude toward his planned appearance.
Why was that?
Because, in 1962, Dr. King, the SCLC, Southern Leadership Conference, were involved in a campaign to desegregate the Albany, Georgia's public facilities. Dr. King had been in and out of Georgia, and someone, I don't think he said, but someone said to me, you know, I don't think that there's ever been we said Negro then, a Negro that had ever spoken at the National Press Club. And I said, I find that hard to believe, but I guess it is. And so I called up Louis Martin, whom who was on the Democratic National Committee.
And do you mind telling this audience who Louis Martin was at the time?
Louis Martin was at that time, in my opinion, the highest-ranking black in the Democratic Party. And so I said, Louis, as Martin appears here. He said, yeah. I said, well, how come? I said, well, the Kennedy administration, you got Pierre Salinger, the press secretary, you got Andrew Hatcher, a Negro, assistant press secretary. I said, why is it taking so long to forget about Martin King, why is it taking so long to get a Negro at the press club? He said, well, I don't know, you need to ask them. That's what I'm asking you. So let me just say, so I had, when I say we, principally Martin Luther King Jr., Stanley Levison and I, but principally Dr. King, we were focused on Albany, Georgia. And we saw the occasion of his having an opportunity to speak at the press club, of him speaking about not just Albany, but the broader issue of race in America. Because, yes, he had received a lot of prominence from the Montgomery bus boycott. And by 1960, he had been on the cover of Time, Look, Life magazine, and all that. But a large majority of America, they just knew about there was this Baptist preacher, this Negro preacher in Montgomery, Alabama. They didn't know too much about him. They didn't know what we knew, that he was probably as erudite and more erudite than most of the people who had spoken at the National Press Club. He has the moniker of being a Baptist preacher, but let me just state to you clearly, Dr. King was brilliant, photographic memory, and was a scholar. Now, I was critical of the National Press Club and also critical of Dr. King because he didn't seem to respond to what I wanted him to take a much more harsher position. I wanted him to when he spoke about being there, I wanted him to actually say as part of the speech, why is it taking so long for a Negro to speak at the National Press Club? He says, no, that's going to be off the issue. Just remember now, this is he's speaking in I think July 1962.
July 19, right.
So, 62. President Kennedy's the President of the United States. Robert Kennedy's the Attorney General, okay? And the speaker before me, the woman mentioned it, but let me just say for the record, from July 13, 1963, July 13, 1963, until December 30th, December 31st, 1967, every single telephone call, without exception, 24/7, every single telephone call that took place between Martin Luther King Jr., Clarence Jones, Stanley Levison, every single one was wiretapped, and the conversations transcribed, first by handwritten notes, and then they were typed and marked top secret. And so it's a little bit off topic, except your listeners should know that with respect to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and J. Edgar Hoover, any opportunity where Dr. King would be a celebrated person was the last thing in the world he wanted. He wanted to destroy his credibility, wanted to destroy his reputation. And so I don't know, I've heard secondhand. I don't have it before me, but I remember reading in the transcript of the wiretap files, his file before they started tapping our joint file in 1963. Hoover had anyway. Everybody knows it.
Well, let me ask Dr. Jones. Let me ask one other final question from me, and then if you could expound. We only have a couple more minutes, and and that's okay. What was Dr. King's reaction after the speech? How did he feel the reception was? What was his thought after this historic speech?
It's interesting because I asked him. I said, "Well, how were you received? I wasn't there." He said, "Well, I thought it went over very well." He said, "But you know, sometimes people have, sometimes even some of our friends, sometimes, Clarence, some of our friends, they have difficulty when you talk about matters publicly that they are embarrassed to hear." And so, from his standpoint, he felt that the mere fact that he spoke at the press club, the mere fact that he talked about the issues which were confronting America as a result of his experience coming from Montgomery and what he was, and I think he mentioned a couple of times, at least one time, I remember in the speech, because I wanted him to mention more, that he was in Albany, Georgia, and I wanted him to talk about Albany, Georgia being like a template, a kind of microcosm of what we're trying to do in the South. In direct answer to your question, he was pleased. I don't think he was. I don't think he was overwhelmed in any way. I think he was just pleased. His first reaction, he says, "Well, he says they didn't boo me." I got an applause. They didn't boo me, and I said, "Well, let's see what happens in the press. How they're going to try to tear you up in the press after it." Now, I don't recall at all.
What happened after that?
Yeah, I don't recall him getting any negative press feedback.
All right, Dr. Jones, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I really appreciate the insight.
Not a problem.
Thank you very much.
Right.
So now let's go to the audio clip of, at least in part, of what Dr. Jones was talking about.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished guests, members of the National Press Club, ladies and gentlemen, I warmly welcome the opportunity to address such a distinguished group of journalists. As has been said, I almost didn't make it. Just last week, I was convicted in the city court of Albany, Georgia, for participating in a peaceful march protesting segregated conditions in that community. I decided, on the basis of conscience, not to pay the fine of $178, but to serve the jail sentence of 45 days. Just as I was about to get adjusted to my new home for 45 days, Reverend Abernathy and I were notified that some unknown donor had paid our fines and that we had to leave the jail. As the Atlanta Constitution suggested the other day, we have now reached a new landmark in race relations. We have witnessed persons being ejected from lunch counters during the sit-ins and thrown into jails during the freedom rides. But for the first time, we witness persons being kicked out of jail. Victor Hugo once said that there is nothing more powerful in all the world than an idea whose time has come. Anyone sensitive to the present moods in our nation must know that the time for racial justice has come. The issue is not whether segregation and discrimination will be eliminated, but how they will pass from the American scene.
Let me start with Cortland Cox, who was a Mississippi organizer during the Civil Rights Movement and has worked with the federal government on minority business development. He is president of SNCC's Legacy Board. And I'm always so intimidated when I get around Cortland because, one, he's just a brilliant individual. Just let me get your initial reaction on, because I know you prepped for this, you must have had some thoughts before you came in here when you were invited. Just your initial reaction about this whole situation and what you just heard, what you heard from Dr. Jones, and also maybe a little history about the relationship of Dr. King with SNCC at that time in Albany.
Before I begin, I'd just like to say that I remember working with, being in the same place with Simeon Booker in Bimini with, when Adam Clayton Powell was there with Dick Gregory. And it was, I guess, maybe 1966 or 1967. And he was a person of high regard at that point and was important to telling the story. As we know, Jet Magazine, along with Simeon and Larry Stills, were very important in getting the message out. What strikes me by listening to Dr. King and listening to Attorney Jones is that while America wants to celebrate how far it has come, and it should celebrate how far it could come, those of us who were involved in getting America to this point face very difficult circumstances. You could hear from Attorney Jones's tone about, being wiretapped, being talked about and thought about as a communist, being disregarded. I mean, clearly King was a brilliant person, as we stated here tonight, but being disregarded as someone who's making a tremendous contribution. That what strikes me about King's opening statement is that understanding all the difficulties that we were facing in Albany, Georgia. Of course, Albany, Georgia, they started the jail no bail discussion. So people went to jail, we were going to fill the jails. People were beginning to really deal with it, direct action. That Dr. King facing all of that in the South, not only in the South, but J. Edgar Hoover, the distrust of, in some respects, of the Kennedy administration, he came here and made such an opening statement. He was able to be affable. He was able to not really give you the sense of frustration that Dr. Jones talked about. And I think that was King's big contribution to America when America needed to see a face of what was going on. The question that was always asked, what do you Negroes want? That was the question that was always posed. And for Dr. King to face all that he faced in the South and come here knowing that he was the first, and as you pointed out, Thurgood Marshall and other people.
Jesse Owens.
Jesse Owens. We can name a number.
Yeah.
Knowing that they had not only disregarded him, but a whole group of people a whole, not because they didn't make any contributions, but because of the ignorance that people had. For him to come here and to be so gracious and to be so good about his opening, I think was the thing that struck me in terms of the opening statement.
And you know, another person came to my mind was, Dr. Ralph Bunche.
Yes.
Had won the
Who had won the Nobel Prize,
Peace Prize, and had not been invited here. Judy Richardson, and I was told to let you know, Cortland, that she was here before you were and on time. They've got a thing going.
Speaking of a Negro first.
Former staff member with SNCC and in the 1960s, and one of the most outstanding documentarians. And to her credit, she worked on the 14-hour Eyes on the Prize that won an Academy Award and the PBS series. Cortland talks about, how Dr. King, in speaking here, was gracious, affable. I made a note, the first attempt at humor in the first part of the speech seemed to fall flat. They didn't. You notice there were a few jokes there that just didn't get any response, and I assume people just didn't get it. I don't know what they were expecting, but they didn't get it. But let's talk about Albany. What was going on in Albany? Now, you're older now, more mature, but at the time, let's be honest, King also had a major confrontations with SNCC at that time in Albany. I read a comment by my good friend, the late, great Julian Bond, who referred to Dr. King as the Lord, and here he comes. Talk about that, because King didn't even bring that into the discussion, did he, here in this speech?
No, and in fact, when they asked him, what is there about the conflict?
Yes.
He deliberately said, we have no conflict.
Really?
And in fact, that's what we always said, because on the on-the-ground organizing, we didn't have that conflict. On-the-ground organizing, SCLC, Dr. King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
NAACP, right?
And particularly the youth groups of the NAACP, particularly the rural areas where the NAACP had Amzie Moore and C.C. Bryant and all of those grassroots leadership, there was no problem. I think we had a different organizing style. It was, Dr. King was this incredible intelligence, but he was also a charismatic leader. And so what we would say is that we were doing grassroots leadership from the bottom up. So when I think about Albany, I think not only of Dr. King and his spending the time in jail, but I think of Mama Dolly, who nurtured us, who protected us with her 12-gauge in Albany,
Now, who
Georgia.
was this?
Mama Dolly is one of the many women in Albany, Georgia, and Terrell County. We used to call it Terrible Terrell, that was right next door. And all of the people, when you listen to, for example, Bernice Johnson Reagan, who is the founder of Sweet Honey in the Rock, primary at the Smithsonian for years, she comes out of that Albany, Georgia movement. And that youth movement was the absolute engine that came through in Albany. But the thing was, we believed in building a leadership locally that would survive even our deaths. So that the main thing was, you're not the leaders. You are building leadership from the ground up, and we were building leadership among those who normally would not have had a voice. So when I look at, for example, now I should say, by the way, unabashed ad for the fact that Eyes on the Prize, all 14 hours, is about to come on Sunday on the World Channel. Sunday, just before Downton Abbey, Sunday at 8 p.m. The first one will be at 7:30 with a 30-minute wraparound. And I've been working on with WGBH. Tomorrow I do a 1-hour webinar with the teachers around how you teach Eyes on the Prize and the expansion of democracy that we really talk about in Eyes on the Prize. But it's all 14 hours. Now, a lot of stations don't get it. Don't get the world, but starting in February, it will go system-wide on PBS. And again, it's all 14 hours. So it's not just Emmett Till, Montgomery, sit-ins, freedom rides. when you get into that second hour, you hear Dr. King in speeches. There's a fourth hour of the second series where it's all devoted to him, and where he's talking against the Vietnam War. You see the Riverside speech. You see, as a matter of fact, when he's talking about the fact that, you know, it didn't cost the nation 1 penny to integrate lunch counters, but now what we need is a radical redistribution of economic power. You see where he is now, which is incredible, but then you see he's going into Chicago in the second series of Eyes on the Prize. You see it in footage, you see it with the people who are interviewed, and you see him going in trying to take that nonviolent action north to Chicago and button right up against Daley. And what happens when you go into northern racism and that entrenched stuff?
But let me ask, how did and feel free to jump in, how did the media, the press respond to this? Because one of the things Carol mentioned in Simeon's book is that Dr. King, most people don't realize this, we now have Eyes on the Prize thanks to you.
And others.
And others, yes, and others. But the reality is a lot of young people here think that it was constant news coverage, that the news coverage was constant, but that was not the case. I see Mr. Franklin wants to jump in on this. But it wasn't constant news coverage, was it? And Lord knows you weren't getting a tremendous amount of news in the Southern campaign.
But you had the black press that was following.
Really? Explain the importance of the black press that was following it.
We had a very divided society at the time. And I'm going to talk about the Washington, D.C. of 1962.
Please. Okay.
African Americans couldn't eat at any of the restaurants near here. We couldn't stay in any of the hotels. My mother and father came here in graduate school. And my father said there was nowhere he could eat except the Supreme Court and the Methodist building when working at the Library of Congress. Of course, we never stayed in hotels in Washington.
Where did you stay?
We stayed with relatives. Whenever we traveled, anywhere, you either took the Green Book, which told you, Mr. Green told you where you could stay, where you could eat, in D.C., in the North, in the South, in Puerto Rico, in the Bahamas, and in Mexico.
So did Dr. King carry a green book around? I mean, I guess what
everyone had to carry at least a set of contacts or phone numbers. When we left here, going to North Carolina, when I saw the Iwo Jima Bridge as a 4-year-old, I knew that meant no more bathrooms, no more restaurants, no more filling stations until we got to our friend's home in Petersburg. And we would take our lunch from here and use the facilities of our friends in Petersburg and eat the lunch.
So tie that into the significance of then Dr. King being invited in July of of being here invited, because then I guess he had to hightail it out of town or stay at cousin whatchamacallum's house.
Right.
I mean,
1962 is
the significance of it.
1962 is the same year that the Cosmos Club rejected Carl Rowan for membership.
When I came to Washington, D.C. in 1960, the Washington Post had ads both for whites and blacks. The only place we could go, the restaurant we could go, I remember, there were, I think, maybe 3 restaurants that black people could go. Evelyn's, Key's Restaurant, and Billy Simpson's. Clifton Terrace, which was right up on 13th, and you know what Clifton Terrace was segregated. Black people couldn't move into that. Stokely Carmichael was one of the first people to move into Clifton Terrace. You know, this place, I mean, Washington, so it wasn't only the press club. I mean, O'Roy Chalk said you couldn't have any black bus drivers because they would steal the money. I mean, you know, this town, you know, we know was ruled by the Southern, I think McMillan and the people from the South, the Congress people from the South.
They were chairs of the
They were chairs, and they
right.
ran the political situation.
Right.
So there wasn't only the press club itself was part of one of the first things I did here when I came to Washington, D.C., is picketed RFK Stadium because they had no black people on the Redskins team. So, you know, I mean, I know Washington, And so basic, when King came here, what John's talking about is what we all face, whether we lived here or whether we were traveling.
So what Simeon did at that point, 50 plus years ago.
It took a lot of heart. It took a lot of heart for Simeon
to walk into that committee.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
In this town, it wasn't just the press club, it was the whole environment, the whole society that was close to the black community. And for Simeon to take that stand was a tremendous courage.
And the professional organizations, the American Bar Association did not accept blacks. The American Medical Association did not accept blacks. The American Dental Association didn't accept blacks. And therefore we had a parallel universe of professional organizations for black doctors, black physicians, black dentists, black attorneys.
All right, let me do this. We've got a video clip you're going to see, and then an audio clip that you will hear. So let's play those, if you don't mind, right now, the video and the audio clip.
We will not obey unjust laws or submit to unjust practices. We will do this peacefully and openly because our aim is to persuade. We adopt the means of nonviolence because our end is a community at peace with itself. We will try to persuade with our words, but if our words fail, we will try to persuade with our acts. We will always be willing to talk and seek fair compromise, but we are ready to suffer when necessary and even risk our lives to become witnesses to the truth as we see it. We are embarked upon a campaign to involve millions of Negroes in the use of the franchise. Some of our workers have already suffered violence and arrests for their efforts, but we will continue. We believe that without intensified actions, a correspondingly expanded federal government program of vigorous law enforcement is indispensable.
This is where nonviolence breaks with communism and any other method which contends that the end justifies the means. In a real sense, the means represent the ideal in the making and the end in process. And so in the long run, destructive means cannot bring about constructive ends because the end is pre-existent in the means. Nonviolent resistance also provides a creative force through which men can channelize their discontent. It does not require that they abandon their discontent. This discontent is sound and healthy, but nonviolence saves it from degenerating into morbid bitterness and hatred. Hate is always tragic. It is as injurious to the hater as it is to the hated. And psychiatrists are telling us now that many of the inner conflicts and strange things that happen in the subconscious are rooted in hate. And so they are now saying, love or perish. And this is the beauty of nonviolence. It says you can struggle without hating. You can fight war without violence. And it is my great hope that as the Negro plunges deeper into the quest for freedom, he will plunge even deeper into the philosophy of nonviolence. As a race, we must work passionately and unrelentingly for first-class citizenship, but we must never use second-class methods to gain it. As I've said so often, we must never succumb to the temptation of using violence in our struggle, for if this happens, unborn generations will be the recipients of a long and desolate night of bitterness, and our chief legacy to the future will be an endless reign of meaningless chaos. The nonviolent resistors can summarize their message in the following simple terms. We will take direct action against injustice without waiting for other agencies to act. We will not obey unjust laws or submit to unjust practices. We will do this peacefully and openly because our aim is to persuade. We adopt the means of nonviolence because our end is a community at peace with itself. We will try to persuade with our words, but if our words fail, we will try to persuade with our acts. We will always be willing to talk and seek fair compromise, but we are ready to suffer when necessary and even risk our lives to become witnesses to the truth as we see it.
Whoa. Let me tell you what my, I didn't get a chance to properly introduce him, but I will, and that is Dr. John W. Franklin, Director of Partnerships and International Programs for the National Museum of African American History and Culture, that gorgeous building you see going up over there. And of course, his father, John Hope Franklin, and along with his father, they co-edited the book, My Life and Era, the autobiography of Buck Colbert Franklin. And he also served as advisor on the documentary film Tutu and Franklin, A Journey Towards Peace. And I got to tell you, Dr. Franklin, that's a tough audience he was speaking before. I mean, there were so many applause lines that I was, I'm listening that today, I mean, people would have been on their feet. Think what we just heard from Cortland and heard from you and the others about what Washington was. The establishment was segregated. And he gave that kind of speech. That had to be, I'm sorry, but it certainly wasn't his audience. I mean, am I over-exaggerating this, Dr. Franklin?
Not at all. But we grew up being able to function in two societies.
In what way and how does that apply to what we heard?
Because we grew up being able to function in the black community, and he went to Boston University, so he can function in white academia. Washington's academic community was as segregated as any other at that time. I asked my father, what were the issues when he arrived here in 1947? And he said the big question in the city was, would George Washington University Lisner Auditorium be open for everyone? And the answer during his lifetime here was no. It remained a segregated facility. So universities, the universities that we see now, Georgetown, American University, George Washington, were exclusively white institutions. The University of Maryland, College Park. My father's the first black professor there in 1964. When we arrive in Hyattsville, there's a crisis of a black family moving in. The neighborhood demands to meet with the history department to ask, who are these Negroes moving in? Why are they coming? How long are they staying? And how many children did they have? So I moved into a hostile Maryland. I didn't think I'd ever want to live in this area. No one spoke to us. I'd lived in hostile New York, but I had not experienced.
So what was the significance, Cortland and Judy, what do you think came out of this speech that we're celebrating here?
I think what's amazing to me is that King was 33 years old.
He was what?
33.
Okay.
Think of another 33-year-old person who not only faced what Judy talked about and what John's talking about, what Simeon wrote about, but he, and you talk about the hostile environment, he had to craft a message and a strategy and a way of approaching that so that we would move forward as opposed to beginning to move in on each other. I mean, when you think of the brilliance of King, at 33 years old, and he had already been on the scene for at least 8 years. So my sense is that I think when people think of, when people understand, think about SNCC and King and so forth, You know, I was in 62, I was 21 years old.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there were others, I mean, old people, we considered people old in SNCC if they were 28. You know, I'm not going to call Tim Jenkins' name. but it does seem to me that what America has to appreciate, not only in terms of King, but in terms of that whole generation of people who were generally ranging from 17, 18 years old to, you know, King being at the outer limits of 33, a whole strategy, a story, a rhetoric that was able to move this country from where it had been to where it needed to go. I mean, I think that is something that people need to really appreciate, the genius of that group of people that made the difference in this country.
And I wondered, because I would assume at that time that most of the members of the press club were active journalists. I mean, they were columnists, they were journalists, but you know, I just wonder what the impact was after that speech. Judy Richardson, yes.
You mentioned the Negro press.
Yes, and how important it was. They were not in that room.
They were not in that room.
Go ahead.
But when when John talks about the alternate universe,
yes,
one of the things that you get amazed about with Dr. King, and you see it throughout, and it's what allowed, even though we may have had different organizing styles in SNCC, I mean, SNCC folk used to go over to Dr. King's house to have Sunday dinner. Prathia Hall would go over there and have Sunday dinner. You know, you would have folks, because there was an interaction, he was so open. So it wasn't just that he was absolutely brilliant. And when you listen to him, it's even different than seeing on the page. When you hear him speak, when you hear that Riverside speech, when you hear a lot of the speeches he's doing around economic equity. I sat in my car here in DC last King holiday at the Whole Food parking lot, right? I'm sitting there because the Pacifica station here, WPFW, was playing a speech he had done about right after he got the Nobel Prize.
He's right.
Yes, and he's talking about Southeast Asia. He gives a 30-minute lecture in the amazing wording and the feeling that he always had. He could storytell that. He picked me in. I mean, I would not move from my car, and it was cold, you know. I would not move from the car because he brought it all home, and the historical grounding that he had was so amazing. But when I mentioned the thing about SNCC and whatever, you know, conflicts there might have been around organizing, that was not about Dr. King, though. There might have been some concerns around some other people on SCLC staff, but not Dr. King, because he was always so open. And he was also brilliant.
Let me just say one last
Yes, Cortland.
I think the question you asked, you know, when I think about it, you know, I think that, I mean, I'm going to give you an answer that may not be the best, but it really didn't make a difference what those journalists
thought in that room.
No, because, you know, let's go back to this communist discussion. Communism was the whole big thing after the McCarthy era and all that. I mean, people think that some of the rhetoric today was bad, but, you know, when we were down there, the whole thing about being communist. And I was down in Mississippi, and a woman from, you know, a local community came up and said to me, I am really glad you communists are here to help us out. You know, because, you know, it didn't make a difference. I mean, SNCC was never, I mean, it was a big deal with Kennedy and this country and so forth, as we're talking about Stan Levinson and other people. But in SNCC and the people who were in the local communities and so forth, all this was foolishness. You know, what all these people, all this chatter of the class where, you know, about whether this was the communists or whether King was this or whether no. They saw their day-to-day realities, you know, the ability to eat, feed their families, deal with terror. We want to talk about terror. we face terror. And the ability, I mean, one of the other big things that I think for King and other people in civil rights movement is that they faced terror and they were able to develop strategies that did not paralyze them. They were able to move to change the country.
Moving.
They kept moving.
Kept moving. Let me now go to our next audio clip. Matter of fact, this will be the last audio clip we'll hear, and it's the end of the speech. So this is near the end of this brilliant speech that he gave here at the National Press Club. Listen up.
We have come to the day when a piece of freedom is not enough for us as human beings, nor for the nation of which we are part. We have been given pieces, but unlike bread, a slice of which does diminish hunger, a piece of liberty no longer suffices. Freedom is like life. You cannot be given life in installments. You cannot be given breath but no body, nor a heart but no blood vessels. Freedom is one thing. You have it all or you are not free. And our goal is freedom. I believe we will win it because the goal of the nation is freedom. Our destiny is bound up with the destiny of America. We built it for two centuries without wages. We made cotton king. We built our homes and homes for our masters and suffered injustice and humiliation, but out of a bottomless vitality continued to live and grow. If the inexpressible cruelties of slavery could not extinguish our existence, the opposition we now face will surely fail. We feel that we are the conscience of America. We are its troubled soul. We will continue to insist that right be done because both God's will and the heritage of our nation speak through our echoing demands. We are simply seeking to bring into full realization the American dream, a dream yet unfulfilled, a dream of equality of opportunity, of privilege and property widely distributed, a dream of a land where men no longer argue that the color of a man's skin determines the content of his character, the dream of a land where every man will respect the dignity and the worth of human personality. This is a dream, and when it is realized, the jangling discords of our nation will be transformed into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood, and men everywhere will know that America is truly the land of the free and the home of the brave.
I'm going to, with our panelists, and we're going to close out, and Bruce Johnson has just arrived, but let me do this as I go across this panel. I made a note. I wonder what the journalists at the National Press Club that July 1962 expected to hear. Now remember, they never heard an African American speak at their luncheon. I doubt if many of them had traveled to Montgomery or the South to hear King speak at the, you know, Dr. Frank, I just wonder, what did they expect to hear? And I don't mean this to be rude, but I wonder, my God, was he talking over their heads? I mean, I wonder if they got it, if they really got it. I'm just asking you to kind of reflect as we close out your guys' portion of this panel.
It's very difficult to imagine what they thought.
Right.
But they probably didn't expect the cogent vision. They may have expected a preacher,
yes,
but not a scholar, you see. And I think that they were probably surprised at the presentation, at the decorum, at his civility. Because if you read Isabel Wilkerson, and she talks about the meanness not just of the laws, but of the customs that control the lives of black people of any status. She said that it really defies migration theory. She's writing about the black migration. She said, because the migration of black people out of this terror is much more like people fleeing famine and war than migration. It upsets migration theory, because what black people were subjected to in the South, and we were subjected to equally in the North, was mean. And I don't think that America expected to hear about itself, to hear that it was not giving the promise of America to everyone.
Judy Richardson, your sense of, as you heard the conclusion of that speech?
I think more about about how he and so many others were able to survive that and to really to build organizations that helped their community survive. I mean, one of the main things about Dr. King was that he was so well grounded in his community, in himself. And so it didn't much matter what the press club thought. I mean, I go back to what Cortland said. You know, he knew what the black press was doing, and that really was an alternate. I mean, when we did Eyes on the Prize, it was Simeon Booker's photos that we could go to.
Yeah.
We couldn't go to Clarion Ledger and Jackson.
Yeah,
right?
Isn't it true that during the Nobel, correct me if I'm wrong, the Nobel Peace Prize, there wasn't a single major mainstream publication when he got the award?
That maybe, I didn't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that was the
But
was the
it
case.
was that
yeah.
alternate universe.
Ebony was
grounded.
there. Had it not been for Ebony, we wouldn't have had photographs. Yeah, Ebony, right?
And the
Mainstream.
Jet.
And
Jet was always
yeah.
there. Yeah.
Afro. All right. Well, all right. We're going to start calling
Okay.
out names now.
That's right.
Yeah.
Chicago Defender.
That's
Pittsburgh Purry.
right.
That's right.
Carol, do you want to bring any comment? Just your thoughts as you were putting together Simeon's book and what you've heard and your thoughts on it quickly?
Well, I was very interested in the questions that the club transcribed from the audience, and it reflects everything that's been said so far.
In what sense? Give us an example.
They were surprised. They were surprised at what they heard. They were dubious. One questioner said, well,
this was the questions that the press club has after every speech.
Yes,
yeah, they have a Q&A.
The audience passes
right.
them up on a little card.
Cards, right.
One of them was something like, this wasn't anything like a speech you gave in Albany or something like that,
Yeah,
right?
right.
And he just very nicely explained, well, when I'm preaching, I preach, and this is not that audience. Here, he was, I'd say, more teaching, more telling people what they needed to know rather than exhorting them to take some kind of action. And after this, he was on Meet the Press, I think 5 times before he was assassinated. So he had larger audiences than this afterwards and had a chance to go over the same kinds of things with 2 or 3 reporters, sometimes Simeon, asking him the question, Lawrence Spivak and all, and Bill Monroe. So this was his introduction to the national press, and it didn't end here. It went on.
And as I look at Simeon, and I want everybody to understand, and Cortland made this point, the courage to be only one of 2 African Americans in the press club at that time, and the courage to go into that speaker's committee and say, I want Martin Luther King to be a luncheon speaker. And then think about this, to have then the chairman quit, give up that chairmanship once the committee decided we were going to do this. It took a great deal of courage on the part of Simeon Booker, who is sitting here, and I think we deserve to. Cortland, I'll give you the final thought for this panel.
Yeah, I think the reaction was a range. I think
A range?
A range of reactions.
Oh, a range. Oh,
I
okay.
think in I think there were a range of reactions. I think that on one end, there were a small group of people who were just hateful on one end. I think the majority of people, it was just something else to do. And then at the other end range, a couple of people like Claude Sitton from the New York Times and a couple of others may have gotten it. I do think, I know at this time, there was a lot of confusion. I know that we would go somewhere to make a speech, and we would talk about, not in such eloquent terms as Dr. King. And, the Q&A question comes up, and the first question we get is it true that you want to marry my daughter? So you would talk about your freedom, and you would talk about the need to change the relationship that existed in this country between blacks and whites. And the first question would come up on several occasions about sex. And so my sense is that when King spoke to this audience, I would say they probably a range of reactions. And they, probably in the middle, I would say probably 15% on one end was just hateful. Maybe another 70% in the middle, it was just something to do. And maybe 15% at the other end got what he was trying to say.
I'm going to introduce now, if we'll move ahead, he had to anchor the news, and those of us here in the Washington, D.C. area are certainly familiar with my good friend, the anchor reporter here in Washington, D.C. at WUSA 9. Ladies and gentlemen, he's won 20 Emmys, 20, and including the prestigious Ted Yates Award, which, by the way, is only given with a unanimous vote of the National Academy of Television, Art, Science, and the Board of Governors, a unanimous vote. And with that, let me welcome to our panel to sort of wrap everything up, Bruce Johnson of WUSA 9. I'm gonna tell on us, Bruce. Bruce emailed me and said, Joe, what am I? I'm going to be late. I'm not going to hear most of the panel, although I think you've been in the back and you've got a chance to hear it. So how should we approach that? And when the two of us start talking on the phone like that, oh my goodness. So I said, Bruce, I kind of bring us up to date. Where are we now? Where's the National Press Club now? But most important, where's the national press now? And you had, it didn't take me but 2 or 3 sentences, and man, you were rolling. And so if you don't mind, I really want you to tell this audience what you said to me on the phone as to the message you really wanted to get across on this occasion where we are finally, after 50-some years, we're recognizing a speech that for the most part many of us are hearing for the very first time, and how fascinating that speech is. And I keep thinking to myself, how does it apply to today? And can we apply it to today?
Thanks.
You're welcome.
I first want to thank everybody up here on this panel. I owe every one of you a debt of gratitude. I'm a beneficiary of Dr. King and each and every one of you. Some of you I know personally, and Simeon especially you. I applaud everything that you've done, your courage. You paved the path. I'm standing on your shoulders and the shoulders of a lot of journalists out here. One of the things I said to Joe is they may not invite me back to speak because I'm going to tell you what I really think and what I've seen, okay? And it's just my opinion. Other people can disagree, but I'm a product of the civil disturbances, if you will, of the 60s, okay? In 1968, I was graduating from high school, and I spilled out into the streets. 28th and Dumanel was the street, National Guard at one end, and we're at the other end. And I gotta be honest with you, I wasn't even sure why I was out there, except that my friends were out there, and it was the thing to do. And so I had to backfill. I later found out why I was out there. Dr. King didn't come to Kentucky and Louisville that often, but he had an incredible impact, on my mother, who was a domestic, who raised 8 kids. And because of inspiration like that from Dr. King, after raising 8 kids at age 52, she got her undergrad degree from the University of Louisville. So that's the cloth that I'm cut from. Enough of that. I have serious concerns about where we are today. And Dr. King knew exactly why he was here addressing the National Press Club, because he came in with an agenda. He didn't need permission. I don't think he's so much worried about what the reporters in the audience were going to say and what they were going to do, what he said. He knew why he was here. I was asking myself when you posed the question, I really don't care, and I'm not sure Dr. King probably cared if they heard what he said. How do you not hear such a great orator? And 33 years old, are you kidding? I've got a son older than that. I want to know what they felt. And that's my concern. Because as I said to Joe on the phone, racism, from where I sit, isn't the issue that it once was. We've got equal protection under the law. Companies now know that racist behavior can cost you a lot of money. You can lose a lot of customers. People know that they can lose their jobs. Of course, a lot of us now go, to social media where a lot of racists can hide and that sort of thing. That's another story. We can get to that later. But indifference is a big issue. That's what I see. A lot of my friends, good friends, white friends, went to the polls, and a lot of them voted for Barack Obama. They thought that was the end. Okay, we've done it. We're there. Okay? I turned to Ron Walters, noted political scientist who's no longer with us. He was at Howard University and then later University of Maryland. And I turned to him in the newsroom. I said, Ron, help me. What does this mean, the election of Barack Obama president? What does it mean for black people, for African Americans? And he says to me, stunned me, quote, not much. It'll give you something maybe to turn to your son, your kids, and say, see, you know what I mean? Much like you do Jackie Robinson, baseball, you've mentioned, Jesse Owens and the others. He says, we won't give you much more than that, okay? And then you proceeded, and he lays it out there like a lot of elders do. They lay it out there, and then you'll figure it out eventually. And that's what he was saying to me, because we didn't have a lot of time. And then you see the president, State of the Union address or whatever. He's giving a speech, and the guy yells out, you lie. What did you feel? I know what I felt. I wonder, what do my white friends feel? And my point being, indifference is still a big problem with my white friends. It's a very big problem with journalists, okay? Race still sells, by the way. We run to a race story because it has all the elements. Chance of violence, fear, misunderstanding, unpredictable. People are going to get locked up. And it's a great live shot. It's a great chance for the anchor to turn to the reporter in the field. Take care out there, okay? Reporter's got all the gear on and stuff, It's great television. But we don't, and I think indifference guides us in a lot of this. We don't go much further than that. We don't look at why people are out there. We don't look at their lives, because then that becomes tedious. It takes a lot of time. The masses aren't interested in that. And, our business, like a lot of businesses, has gone through a lot of change. You see where newspapers are disappearing. Philadelphia Inquirer today is looking at going nonprofit. Reporters are losing their jobs. Reporters are constantly working under the threat of losing their jobs. Good side of social media is that those not covered by mainstream can now maybe go out and start their own publications. But if you're still working for the big papers, the Post, New York Times, that kind of place, you're worried about your job, paying your mortgage, and that sort of thing. So you fall in line. You may not have time for those kind of stories that you think really need to be told and explored. But it doesn't even have to be that complicated. Look on Sunday television. Pick a network, your favorite network. Not Fox, because they're a little different, but pick the other ones. The ones you consider, okay, mainstream. I'm going to tell you what you're going to find. If it's about race, civil rights, you're going to find black people on the panel. If it's about the economy, if it's about international affairs, if it's about politics at the highest level, chances are it's going to be an all-white panel. chances are it's going to be a predominantly white male panel, okay? They're going to sprinkle in white women. White women are the biggest beneficiaries of affirmative action. That's not an opinion, that's a fact, okay? That's not slamming anybody, it's a fact. Indifference makes that picture so. Nobody looks at it and says, what's wrong with this picture? It's not like there aren't qualified African-American journalists or Hispanic journalists or Asian-American journalists. Nobody thought of it. And guess who didn't think of it? The guy making the decision. Who do you think the guy making the decision? It's the same guy who years ago, after Dr. King and after we took to the streets in '68, was made to think diversity. It takes work to think out of your box. I mean, if it's just me and my boys, I mean, I'd be sitting up here with a bunch of my Kappa Alpha Psi brothers. I mean, these are my guys. That's not diversity. That's more of me. You know what I mean? You know exactly what I'm talking about. It takes work. We no longer work at diversity. That's my problem. You know, you got to think outside your box.
So what do we work at? What do you in the media work at?
Guys like me, I mean, we have
well, not you.
Yeah, well, I was going to say because we have a responsibility.
Yeah.
You know, and you're rewarded for that. I mean, these people out here, the people in D.C., I mean, and elsewhere, they reward me for that because that's what we're about. You know, doesn't mean that if you're wrong, I'm not going to call you out on it. You're going to be tough. Or you're going to be run out of the business because that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to make people uncomfortable. We're supposed to be holding public officials and private accountable and that sort of thing. You still do that. The diversity thing comes from just training, turning this thing around. It's what Dr. King's talking about. Don't hire one guy. I don't want a piece of bread. You know, you can count. And diversity is good business. I mean, come on. I mean, is it really that difficult? Diversity is good business. If I want black people to watch me, if I want Hispanic people to watch me, if I want Asian Americans to watch me, I'm putting them on TV. And then I'm going to charge you as a black and Asian American, Hispanic, to go out and cover that community. Because maybe this guy can't, but also, it's no excuse that you can't cover that community. And again, we come back to disinterest. I haven't made it part of my training to know your community or your community, okay? And the worst culprit of all to me is the minority who comes into the shop and doesn't want to cover his or her community. Well, I mentor a lot of young people. Had a young Hispanic woman who didn't want to cover the Hispanic community. She's bilingual. I said, are you kidding me? Then that's your base. They're looking at you because of you.
So why do you think that exists? Why aren't there more Simeon Bookers?
Takes courage. You have to stand up to the power struggle. Number one, you have to be good. Keep in mind, I mean, this is a business. You have to convince people, and sometimes you do it through your work, that a good story is a good story. 60 Minutes, think about it. I mean, in terms of editing and being slick, it's actually some of the worst television, production-wise, there is. But it's the number one show in all of television because they tell good stories. You learn as you go along. It's a big part of my job to teach as I do these stories, to teach those that I work with and those that watch, our viewers. Here's a good story. Here's something you need to know about this person.
Let me bring up a thought and I'm thinking about parallels here. We have the former SNCC folk here. You're always SNCC people. You're never former, you're always SNCC. You'll be SNCC until the day you're no longer here. You'll go to heaven being SNCC. And I'm thinking now parallel Black Lives Matter. I swear there is a parallel there, that the Black Lives Matter young people get treated and covered the way that they covered the SNCC young people. Now, am I right or wrong?
I want to say this about Black Lives Matter. Okay, again, getting back to the white people, for the most part, had no idea that police this way in their communities and that way in black communities. The Washington Post has done a great job with the data. I mean, more armed white people get shot by police than armed black people, okay? But more unarmed black people get shot by police than white people. Why is it most of the fatal shootings are coming at the hands of white male police officers? My point being, I'm not trying to gauge somebody where their heart and their mind and all that is, training is probably a big part of this. But if you know this kind of stuff, you can train them up front. We know that community policing works. We know that a police department, just go to West Baltimore, we know that a police department that isn't from the schools, that doesn't live in the community or even in the city and lives so far, they're considered an occupied force. Zero tolerance to a police department means you got to get those numbers up. You got to get anybody who, if I chase you and you run, now I've got cause to arrest you. You know, that's zero tolerance. And that happens in some communities. But trust me, a white kid running down Wisconsin Avenue, butt naked, is not going to be arrested. He's going to be taken maybe to a mental institution, but he's not going to be arrested. He's not going to be treated the same way should that same situation happen in other parts of town. Black Lives Matter, they've opened the eyes, just like SNCC did and these other groups, to this sort of thing happening.
Yeah, you wanted to say, go ahead, Cortland.
I think there is a mindset of who people define. We have been, in the black community, they're defined one way, and in the white community, it's defined another, given the example that Bruce just talked about. But the thing that's going to be critical, that's going to really turn things around, is this whole drug issue.
In what way?
There were 49,000 drug overdoses in the United States last year. Number one state is Utah, the other, Vermont, New Hampshire. These are in the white communities where opiates. So when
but let me interrupt a second. But the governor of Maine said it's because you black men are coming up to Maine on the way out impregnating these fair-haired.
He had to add that, but
I had to bring that up.
But people get introduced to these drugs and heroin through opiates. What we're going to beginning to see is, we know most black people are in jail today, a lot of them, for use of drugs. And it was a criminal, zero tolerance and all that. Now it's happening in the white community. Now it's a social problem. It's a problem of health. And I think that at some point, what the difference is who's making the decision, who's making the call. And so at this point, I think as we begin to, you're going to see another iteration beyond Black Lives Matter, where we're going to begin to come back to this discussion of seeking power, to be able to define our lives, to define what the definitions are of good and bad, to define where money is spent in terms of governmental budgets, to begin to define how the police act. Because I think at some point, we're going to move from the discussion of just being in protest to seeking to be in power. And I think that's the next stage.
I think one of the main things, too, is that, and Cortland and I are on the SNCC Legacy Board. We're in a 3-year collaboration with Duke University. What we did in September was a lot of the young activists from the larger Black Lives Matter wanted to know, what did you all do? Now, we don't have the answers, right? But we also knew that the communication between what do you do about grassroots organizing, deep-seated in the community, not just mobilizing, not just demonstrating. And they really wanted to know, how do you do that? So Umi comes in from the Trayvon Martin group in Florida, and he's saying, you know, I was thinking about how do I start doing something beyond just responding? How do you start being proactive? And how do you do something beyond just demonstrating when the cops kill yet another black person?
All right. I have 1 minute. Bruce, I'm going to get, he said, who's in charge? And since we're at the National Press Club for this prestigious moment, so my question, if you could wrap it up, who's in charge of the news media? Because these stories, you know, look, I think Ted Koppel said it. Today, the media tends to give people what they want instead of what they need. And that's not good for democracy. Who's in charge, Bruce?
Well, I don't buy.
As quick as you can.
I don't buy that. We tell people what they need first, then we give it to them. In other words, you know, we give them back, you know, the answer that they gave us. Most people can't tell you, you know, what they want from the media. You judge that by how many people watch it. They want to be included. They want it balanced. They want black people covered as part of the mainstream and not just the underclass, those getting, you know. I say, and there is no simple answer to this, but I say to my young people all the time, and I mentor Jesus, an incredible number of diverse people, that when you go out and you do that story on the Board of Education, think in terms of not just people that look like you and think like you and act like you. Think in terms of we have the same values. We're also interested in our kids being educated. We also have some skills and some knowledge when it comes to education, when it comes to business, when it comes to science, when it comes to all these. Does it have to be a white guy? Does it have to be a white scientist? Does it have to be a white mathematician, an MBA? You have to work at diversity. And that's what Dr. King was saying. You're changing the mindset. You're changing the culture here. That's what who's in charge. The Indians are in charge, with all due respect. I mean, you want to go back to an old expression. You know, we decide. It's a collective thing. You sit around an editorial room, but count who's at the table. That's who decides. If there's nobody looking like you at the table, you're not deciding. You're not deciding. The people at the table decide. Then a guy like me will come in afterwards, coming in late. That's not going to work. And then you take it apart, okay? A woman will come in and take it apart. That's who decides, people at the table.
All right.
Nobody's sitting up there at corporate telling us, you know.
Okay, with that, can we give this distinguished group of people, please, a round? Outstanding. Outstanding. And I'll end with a shameless plug. You will be able to hear this on Sirius XM, channel 126, Martin Luther King Day, Monday morning. We'll have it on our show. We'll actually play it back twice, so it'll be all morning long. And let me thank all of you. And Hughes, thank you for doing this. And if it does get moved when you come back and you need help in a nonviolent approach, call me. I'll make sure that we'll bring a group of people. We'll keep it where it should be prominent. I think Dr. King would be proud of these people and proud of all of us, and thank you for finding that speech. May it never be lost again. Thank you very much. Thank all of you. Long to have of the first speaker in 1962, you could have had Jackie Robinson, Thurgood Marshall, Marian Anderson, the list goes on and on and on, Booker T. Washington. Then you realize that they didn't admit their first woman to the press club until 1971. And Nikita Khrushchev made that happen. So we've come a long way. And the person who has watched that journey is Simeon Booker. Simeon Booker, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't know, Jet Magazine would not be Jet Magazine without that Simeon Booker piece. And so, and his wife, Carol, is right beside him, and let's give her a round of applause for the work that she has done. Now, Simeon, first of all, thanks for being here. And let's get to this. You were on the committee that actually decided to invite Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to be the speaker. To the best of your recollection, what went on in that meeting? What was it like? And Carol, if you can fill in, because I know there's an extensive paragraph in his autobiography about that meeting. But what do you remember, Simeon?
Two hearing aids make this a challenge. What do you remember about the decision to invite Dr. King? Do you remember some tension on the Speakers Committee? Doesn't remember. But he did remember when he wrote this book. So he's asked me to tell you.
Read that, and then maybe it might jar his memory there.
At 97, memory fades with every day.
But this chapter in that book, yes.
It is. This is from Shocking the Conscience,
Right.
A Reporter's Account of the Civil Rights Movement, which Simeon wrote in 2013. It was published by University Press of Mississippi, ironically. But he writes that he remembered the first time that Dr. King spoke at the club in 1962. Simeon was only the second member of the club. The
Second African-American member.
Second African-American. The first being Louis Lortier. But Louis didn't participate. And when Simeon was sponsored for membership, he was urged to be an active member. And he was. He joined the Speakers Committee, which was one of the most important committees because it was the committee that chose the speakers for these wonderful newsmaker luncheons here at the club. So he proposed that Dr. King speak. Now, Dr. King had gotten some notoriety, a lot of press, because of the Montgomery bus boycott, but he had never been interviewed by the national press. And Simeon thought the time had come. It was a year before the March on Washington and the I Have a Dream speech. And it was 2 years before Dr. King became the youngest recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. So, and he still had not been named Time Magazine's Man of the Year either. So Jet Magazine had had Dr. King on its cover at least twice. And if you know the history of Jet Magazine, the cover was usually a young starlet, a pretty young woman. Here was a newsmaker taking the cover, and that was rather unusual for Johnson Publishing. And King had never addressed a large audience of the national press. Also at the same time in 1962, maybe even earlier, but in 62 at least, the FBI itself will admit that J. Edgar Hoover had targeted Dr. King as a possible pawn of the communist movement in America, as anybody who participated in civil rights at that time was suspect by the FBI as being not only a troublemaker, but possibly a pawn of the communist movement. So J. Edgar Hoover used the press, people that he knew, to send out rumors. And I think it might have been that, more than any racial issue, that caused dissension on
the committee to invite him to speak.
Yes, because the chairman of the committee resigned in protest when the committee accepted Simeon's recommendation that Dr. King speak.
The chairman of the Speakers Committee.
Yeah. So he was the only one, but the speech itself, as we'll get to later on, is a magnificent speech. And you can tell from the questions that followed it that the seed had been planted, because there is one question about whether it had been written by Stanley Levinson, a New York lawyer who was considered
that day. That's available on the website, free. Feel free to access that and learn a lot more about this speech after tonight. After we hear the clips and discuss them, Joe will interview journalist Bruce Johnson, and then Joe will close the program promptly at 9 p.m. Now, Dr. King's appearance here was one of the most significant things to ever happen at the National Press Club. And to mark the significance of this event, and let me tell you, it's long past due, we've made a plaque that we're bringing out for the first time here today. And I said at the beginning of my presidency we were going to do this. We're going to put this plaque right outside these doors of the ballroom, just to the left. There's a photo of LBJ and Nixon there right now. LBJ and Nixon are just going to get moved. They're not going to go away. but they are going to get moved because that is a highly prominent spot to have observed that this highly significant event happened, and that plaque will be at the National Press Club, which really is a living museum. If you walk around and look at the walls, that plaque will be there as long as the Press Club stands. And while I am only president for another week, believe me, if I ever come back and do not see that plaque hanging there, there will be nonviolent direct action to make sure that that plaque is returned. And I don't think anybody's ever going to move it, frankly, because we're all in awe of what we're all going to hear tonight. And I heard some of the excerpts earlier this afternoon, and it sent chills down my spine. With no further ado, I want to introduce Mr. Joe Madison.
Thank you. For more than half a century, Simeon Booker devoted his career in journalism to race relations, black politics, and watched the civil rights movement evolve from its very beginning. And the stories that he and his fellow black journalists told and the things they encountered are chronicled in a book that he has written, a biography. In putting this panel together, the first thing we had to do was make sure that all the participants were alive and here with us. And when you consider it's been 50 plus years, we wanted to dig deep and far and get people who understood exactly what went on. You know, it's interesting, the National Press Club, the very first speaker, as you heard, was African-American speaker, was Martin Luther King Jr. And you begin to wonder, why did it take so long?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the National Press Club. My name is John Hughes. I'm the president of the National Press Club. I'm also an editor for Bloomberg's First Word. That's Bloomberg News's breaking news desk here in Washington. We are here for a special event. For the first time in 53 years, we will hear Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King, in his own voice, addressing the National Press Club. We will hear his voice here in the very room where he spoke. Dr. King stood approximately right in the middle of that area over there. We will have experts commenting on the significance of his words at the National Press Club that day. First, I want to introduce some people without whom this event would not be possible. Gil Klein was the organizer. Gil is a former National Press Club president. He's chairman of the club's History and Heritage Committee, and he's the journalism director of American University's Washington Semester Program, and we thank him for all the work he put into organizing this program. Joe Madison is our moderator. Joe. Joe is known as the Black Eagle. He is heard coast to coast each weekday morning on Sirius XM's Urban View channel. Talker magazine has named him one of the 10 most important radio talk show hosts on 9 different occasions. And we so appreciate his work on this program and that he's willing to be our moderator. Joe will be introducing our distinguished guests on the panel to my left. However, I want to say a few words about one of them. Mr. Simeon Booker is one of, yes. Mr. Simeon Booker, sitting to the second of my left, is one of the all-time greats of American journalism. In 1982, he won the National Press Club's highest honor, the Fourth Estate Award, given for career achievement. He was the first African American to win the award. He was the 10th person to ever win it. And Mr. Booker, it is an extreme privilege to have you here in the club. You are our hero. This club is your house. Welcome home. I also want to welcome our C-SPAN and Sirius XM audiences, and you can follow the action on Twitter this evening. Use the hashtag NPCLive. That's NPCLive for everyone on Twitter. Now, here's a little background on the speech. Dr. King was the first African American to ever speak at a National Press Club luncheon. He did this on July 19th, 1962. The speech came 1 week after his second arrest in Albany, Georgia. And he would be arrested a third time in Albany at a prayer vigil exactly 8 days after he gave this speech. His press club talk came more than a year before Dr. King's most famous "I Have a Dream" speech on the National Mall. Now, here is how the evening will work. First, Joe Madison will interview Mr. Booker, who was a club member who not only attended the speech in 1962, but he helped organize it as a member of the club's Speakers Committee. Second, Joe will interview by telephone Dr. C.B. Jones. Dr. Jones helped write the speech. Then we will hear 4 speech excerpts in the order that Dr. King said them. We will hear his opening, and we will hear his closing. And we have 2 excerpts in the middle of the speech. There will be a panel discussion of these first, middle, and ending sections after each section. One of these middle excerpts is a video clip. Everything else is audio, but there is one video clip. This video clip is the only known video clip of this speech to exist. There is no video or film of this event beginning to end that we know of, and we've searched far and wide. At the time we were doing these National Press Club lunches in the 60s, we only recorded them. We did not film them all as we do today. So while there is no video of the entirety of the speech, and we are not able to play for you the entirety of the speech in the Q&A because that would take too long, I want you to know that this video clip, the audio, and the entire speech is on our website at press.org/MLK. That's press.org/MLK. You will also see there a printed transcript of this entire event, beginning to end, including all the questions he was asked.